2021 Trinity University Women's Intercollegiate Athletics, or TUWIA, History Project.
This summer, our goal has been to create a digital archive and exhibit space dedicated to preserving and sharing the under-researched histories of women athletes at Trinity.
Our digital representation of those stories is the newest contribution to the overarching TUWIA Oral History Project. It started in 2015 when alumna and founder of the women's track team, Peggy Coconut Kaplan, couldn't find women's athletic records predating the 1990s.
Following her realization, the TUWIA team has conducted archival research and oral history interviews with alumni, produced a draft of a book chronicling the 150-year history of Trinity women's athletics, and now our website, which includes a directory of women's sports teams, a timeline of women's athletics, and 2 exhibits focusing on particular aspects of women's athletics.
So one thing I've been working on for this project is scanning the images and preparing them for Omeka, doing things like file conversions, and then uploading them into our database, which is Omeka. And then I've also been working on entering in the metadata. And what metadata is information like the date, the publisher, description of the object, the source, where the physical file is, stuff like that. And all of those things help to contextualize the image and kind of further explain the content and what it's describing and what it's depicting. And one of the things I've been really focused on is writing really clear, accessible descriptions of what's going on in the picture. So for someone who's maybe visually impaired or using a screen reader, they can still tell what's going on in the picture if I've given a good description of the image. So we've been keeping all the metadata organized in our big spreadsheet, which allows us to keep it organized and get it all sort of laid out and ready to go before we input it all into Omeka, which is kind of a tedious process. You have to input each piece of information individually, and so it's really important to make sure you're taking the proper care when you're inputting that information so you don't accidentally sort of get it wrong and mix up the images.
So the first project that we worked on was the directory of all intercollegiate sports teams involving women between the 1970s, around the ratification of Title IX, through the 1990s. And the reason why I say all sports teams involving women rather than all women's sports teams is because many of those teams were co-ed or even predominantly male. But what mattered to us most was watching the progression of women's sports involvement after the ratification of Title IX. And our conclusion was that it was pretty significant. The way we made the directory was we would go through the digital Mirage yearbook archives and clip all of the images and rosters of the sports teams involving women. Then Hope would create the metadata for them, and then we would put them all on the Omeka pages. The second project that we worked on was the timeline of women's sports history at Trinity. And so the goal of this timeline was to chronicle the key events and the key figures in the history of women's sports, specifically from around the 1920s at the Waxahachie campus to the end of the 20th century, when we really had a thriving women's sports program. So the first things that we did were we chose about 20 to 25 events that we felt were representative of the history, and then we would choose the items in the archives that we wanted to visually represent those events on the timeline. And that was really difficult because we were trying to make decisions about what we felt was most important or most representative of the entire process, and so we were really experiencing what it was like to create history. And then the next thing we did was Hope would write the metadata, and then I would write the text for the events for the timeline. We would put it all in a spreadsheet and then upload it to Omeka. And then another thing that we were worried about, not only with the timeline, but with the entire website, was accessibility in terms of color palette and color blindness. So we would use an online tool to see what different color palettes would look like with different kinds of color blindness and use that to create a palette for the website.
So in creating the Home Field Disadvantage exhibit, I knew I wanted to do something with physical inequities, especially after having a conversation with Betsy, who's been in charge of the oral history project in the upcoming book. So from there, I went and read through parts of Betsy's manuscript and especially listened to the oral histories that we have. And I pulled out oral history quotes and areas that I wanted to highlight in the exhibit that I thought showed off not only what was physically lacking, but how the athletes felt about it. From there, I navigated the archives with the skills I got from the directory and the timeline research, and found images, blueprints, and articles to support my ideas. I then created a rough draft of how I wanted my exhibit to look. Originally, it was going to be chronologically broken up between 3 different time periods, but in gaining more research and figuring things out, my mentors, teammates, and I decided that that was the safe way to go, and reorganizing the material based on subject made more sense to what I was trying to accomplish. And one of the fun things that I found is I stumbled across the Title IX compliance report by John Moore to President Ron Calgard in 1979, which was mentioned in one of the interviews but hadn't been able to be found. It was in another box that was different than the one it should have been in, and it was a really important way to see how the administration thought about the inequities of the women's athletic program. And from there, it was inputting and organizing this material into a mecha and getting it to look how it looks now.
So my name is Samantha Henry. I'm on the women's basketball team, and this project was funded in part by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education for McNair Scholars Program and the Mellon Initiative. My work focused on contextualizing the oral histories from the 1960s through the 2000s. I also conducted an oral history, which included training on the proper techniques on how to interview, prior research of my interviewee, a pre-interview meeting, follow-up with the interviewee, conducting the actual interview, and more follow-up with the interviewee to continue an open line of communication. By going through these oral histories and thinking about women's athletics, I decided to create an exhibit to really illuminate these athletes and their experiences on a complete scale. My exhibit has 3 sections about Title IX, Division III athletics, and the impact of those 2 topics on women athletes at Trinity. Title IX was a pivotal moment in the history of women's athletics because it allowed more women to be involved in sports, but at Trinity there still wasn't much change in women's sports until women stepped up and fought for rights on the playing fields. Women athletes struggled with stereotypes, with the questioning of femininity, and there were also issues with the lack of diversity at Trinity. There were hardly any underrepresented women in sports until the 90s. As far as Division III, it was created by the NCAA in 1973. When Trinity changed from Division I to Division III in the 90s, they fully cut tennis scholarships. Division III allowed Trinity athletes to have a well-balanced student-athlete life, making them more than just an athlete. I found that many of these women commented on qualities gained from Trinity being able to focus on more than just their sport. I highlight standout women athletes at Trinity, success of women athletes today, and overall, I found that Trinity female athletes have worked their way into the spotlight on and off the field, using their platforms to remind people that life is bigger than one person and it is bigger than just sports. Trinity women athletes are empowered, and hopefully this exhibit makes those contributions visible. We all feel so honored to have been a part of this project and to help gather, interpret, and share these stories with the public. Women's athletics is a subject that has often been left out of feminist scholarship despite the close relationship it had with the feminist movements of the past couple centuries.
That relationship is even true at Trinity, where women's athletics only grew in small steps over the course of decades, and only with the efforts of dedicated coaches, administrators, and of course, student athletes. The progression of Trinity women's athletics also closely parallels the social movements of the past centuries, from the increase in women's sports teams after the ratification of Title IX, to the slow yet still not equitable growth of diversity on teams starting in the 1990s around the introduction of intersectionality theory.
As TUWIA research continues, we will keep collecting, documenting, and sharing the stories of women athletes at Trinity so that we as a community can better understand the women who led us to the present day.